The boy who would not speak. The Evans household had grown accustomed to silence, but not the peaceful kind. It was the kind of silence that sat heavy in the air, pressing down on conversations, turning words into ghosts before they could ever be spoken. It had been this way for 5 years, ever since Liam Evans stopped speaking at 10 years old. Liam should have been a boy brimming with curiosity, his days filled with endless chatter about his favorite cartoons, the bugs he found in the backyard, or the stories he made up in his head. But he wasn't. He hadn't uttered a single word since his 5th birthday. Since something had stolen his voice. Doctors and specialists were perplexed. His vocal cords were fine, his cognitive functions normal. The diagnosis was selective mutism, a psychological response to trauma. Yet, no one knew what had caused it. There had been no known accidents, no major family disruptions, no visible signs of abuse. The trauma was a mystery. His parents, Daniel and Claire Evans, had exhausted every avenue. Therapy, patience, encouragement. Nothing worked. Over time, frustration gave way to reluctant acceptance. The Evans family adapted. They learned to communicate with Liam through gestures, nods, and writing. The silence didn't just belong to Liam anymore. It belonged to the whole house. It was as if they, too, had become afraid of words. And maybe, just maybe, Liam wasn't just protecting himself. Maybe he was protecting someone else. A gathering of shadows. On a cool Sunday afternoon, the Evans home was unusually lively. Laughter, chatter, and the aroma of roasting chicken filled the air. Family members gathered to celebrate Liam's grandfather's 70th birthday. It was one of the rare moments when the heavy silence was drowned out by the sounds of normalcy. In the kitchen, Claire was setting the table, her hands moving with practiced ease as she balanced plates of steaming food. Daniel stood near the dining area, locked in quiet conversation with his brother, his fingers drumming against his whiskey glass. The cousins played outside, their shrieks of delight floating in through the open windows. And Liam, he sat alone in the living room, curled into the corner of the couch, knees pulled up, eyes fixed on the television. The flashing images reflected off his pale blue eyes, but he wasn't watching. Not really. He was just letting the noise exist around him, preferring to be an observer rather than a participant. Then, the television program was interrupted. A breaking news banner flashed across the screen. Authorities have made a shocking discovery today. Human remains were uncovered in the woods near Oak Ridge Hollow, potentially linked to the long unsolved disappearance of teenage girl Ellie Carter, who vanished 5 years ago. Liam's body stiffened. A hush fell over the room as the adults turned toward the television, their conversations fading into stunned silence. The screen flickered, shifting to footage of the dense stretch of forest, now cordoned off with bright yellow tape. Officers moved through the trees, forensic teams working under the glare of floodlights. The camera zoomed in on a tarp-covered section of the ground, where something dark and unsettling had been unearthed. Liam's breath caught in his throat. A photograph of Ellie Carter flashed onto the screen. A teenage girl, no older than 17, smiling brightly with sun-kissed freckles and dimples. Liam felt something deep inside him stir, something that had been locked away for years, buried in the silence he had built around himself. And then, for the first time in 5 years, he spoke. His voice, raspy from years of disuse, barely above a whisper, yet it sliced through the silence like a knife. He did it. The entire house froze. The clinking of glasses stopped. Conversations ceased. Even the faint background hum of the television seemed to vanish. Claire, who had been standing near the kitchen counter, dropped the glass she had been holding. It shattered against the tile floor, but she didn't move, her face drained of color. Daniel's grip on his whiskey glass tightened so hard his knuckles turned white. Liam remained still, his gaze locked on the television screen, his fingers digging into the couch cushions. He didn't notice the stunned expressions of the family around him. He didn't see the way his mother's face twisted in panic, or the way his father's jaw clenched so tightly it looked like he was in pain. Claire was the first to move. She rushed toward Liam, kneeling in front of him, her hands gripping his arms. "Liam," she breathed, voice shaking. "What did you just say?" Liam blinked, his wide eyes flickering toward her for only a second before he shut down again. The words had been spoken, and now they were gone. The silence was back, stronger than ever, wrapping around him like an iron cage. Claire turned toward Daniel, her voice rising in desperation. "Did you hear him? He just spoke." Daniel exhaled sharply, his face unreadable. "It's been years, Claire. He probably just repeated something from the news." Claire whipped her head toward him, her breath uneven. "He did not just repeat something, Daniel. She stopped, swallowing hard. Liam wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at his father, and something was very wrong. Daniel hadn't moved. His hands were gripping the edge of the dining table, his shoulders tight. Unlike the rest of the family, who were staring at Liam in shock, Daniel's expression wasn't one of disbelief. It was one of fear. The fear that followed. What followed was chaos. Claire spent the rest of the evening on the phone, cycling through frantic conversations with family members, trying to make sense of what had happened. "He spoke," she repeated, her voice breaking each time. "After 5 years, he finally spoke, and he said he knew who did it." Every call followed the same pattern: sharp intakes of breath, disbelief, then hesitant murmurs of, "Are you sure?" But that was the problem. No one was sure of anything. Liam remained curled up in his room, knees to his chest, his mind racing but unable to grasp the memory that had surfaced so suddenly. It was there. He could feel it pressing against the edges of his mind. But the moment he tried to reach for it, it slipped away, like sand through his fingers. Daniel was different too. He didn't try to comfort Claire. He didn't offer explanations. Instead, he retreated to his study, closing the door behind him, leaving his whiskey untouched on the counter. Claire noticed. She noticed everything. By midnight, she was sitting at the dining table, laptop open, her eyes scanning the screen with growing horror. She had spent hours reading archived articles, searching for anything that could explain why her son, who had not spoken a word in 5 years, suddenly recognized the name of a missing girl. Then she saw it. The date Ellie Carter disappeared. 5 years ago. The exact year Liam stopped speaking. Claire's breath came shallow and sharp. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Something happened that year. Something that took her son's voice. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Claire realized the truth. Liam wasn't just afraid of speaking. He was afraid of who might be listening. The secrets in the dark. The memory that refused to surface. Liam sat in his dimly lit room, knees pulled to his chest, staring at the wall as if it held the answers buried deep in his mind. His breath came in uneven shudders, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. But he didn't move. He couldn't move. His entire body was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of what had just happened. I spoke. The realization hit him like a crashing wave. But it was not relief he felt. It was terror. For 5 years, silence had been his shield. It had protected him, kept him safe, kept everyone around him safe. But now his voice had broken through the barrier, and the consequences were already unfolding around him. His mother had heard him. The entire family had heard him. But more importantly, his father had heard him. Liam wasn't sure what scared him more, the memory pressing against the edges of his mind, or the way his father had looked at him when he spoke. Daniel Evans had always been a man of control, a man of carefully measured expressions, of steady hands, and even steadier words. But tonight, Liam had seen something crack in his father's face, something raw and unfiltered. Fear, not confusion, not disbelief, not relief that his son had spoken for the first time in years. Pure, undeniable fear. Liam squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to breathe, but the pressure in his chest wouldn't let up. He reached for the fragmented images swirling in his mind, shadows stretching through the trees, the crunch of leaves beneath his feet, the sound of screaming. Ellie Carter's face, frozen in terror, and a voice. A deep voice. Familiar. His hands clenched into fists. Why couldn't he remember? Or worse, what if his mind was trying to protect him from remembering? The house of lies. Claire didn't sleep that night. After hours of poring over articles, piecing together timelines, and replaying Liam's words in her mind, she had come to only one conclusion. Her son had been there. The night Ellie Carter disappeared, Liam had seen something. Maybe even everything. Her hands trembled as she sifted through the old reports. Ellie had vanished without a trace, last seen walking home from a friend's house near Oak Ridge Hollow. The police had launched an extensive investigation, searching the woods, questioning the town. But no solid leads had ever emerged. And now, after all these years, her son, her silent, broken son, had recognized something about the case. Claire turned away from the laptop screen and glanced toward the dark hallway. Daniel's study door was still shut, the sliver of light beneath it faint but unyielding. She knew he was awake. She knew something was wrong. A deep, twisting unease coiled in her stomach. She pushed her chair back, standing slowly, her breath shallow as she made her way toward the study. She hesitated for only a second before pushing the door open. Daniel was sitting at his desk, his back to her, shoulders hunched. He didn't startle when she entered. He had been expecting this. On the desk in front of him were scattered documents, folders, news clippings, and a photograph, not of Ellie Carter, but of Liam. Claire's stomach dropped. "What are you doing?" she whispered. Daniel inhaled slowly, not turning around. "You shouldn't be in here." Her fingers curled around the edge of the desk, her breath uneven. He spoke, "Daniel. I know. You don't seem surprised." A heavy silence fell between them. Then, finally, he turned to face her. His face was calm, too calm, but his eyes betrayed him. There was something there, something dark, something dangerous. Claire took a step back. "Daniel," her voice wavered. "What aren't you telling me?" His expression remained unreadable. "You need to let this go, Claire." She shook her head. No, I won't let this go." "What happened that night?" Daniel stood up slowly, towering over her, his voice lowering. "You don't want to know." A chill ran down Claire's spine. For the first time in their marriage, she was afraid of her husband. A town that doesn't forget. By the next morning, the entire town knew. Word spread fast in small places like theirs. The story of Liam's sudden outburst at the Evans family gathering had already reached the ears of old friends, neighbors, and, more importantly, the authorities. Detective Michael Calloway had been working Ellie Carter's case for years. It had haunted him, taunted him, made him question every missed opportunity and failed lead. So when he got the call about Liam Evans, the boy who hadn't spoken in 5 years suddenly saying he did it, Calloway didn't hesitate. By noon, he was knocking on the Evans' front door. Claire answered, her face pale but composed. She had expected this. "Mrs. Evans," Calloway said, tipping his head. "I heard about what happened last night. I'd like to speak with Liam, if that's all right." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward the staircase. "He's not well." It took everything in him just to say those words. Calloway's jaw tightened. "I understand. But if your son remembers something, if he knows who did this, then we need to talk to him." Claire took a slow, shaky breath before stepping aside. "Come in." A name that shouldn't be spoken. Liam sat curled on the couch, his fingers gripping the hem of his sweater as Calloway lowered himself onto the armchair across from him. "Hey, Liam." The detective's voice was calm, steady. "I'm Detective Calloway. I work on cases like Ellie's." Liam didn't speak, but he listened. Calloway studied the boy carefully. He had worked with children before. He knew the signs of trauma. the way their bodies held memories their minds refused to process. He also knew that forcing him to speak wouldn't work. So he tried something else. Calloway reached into his pocket, pulling out a photograph. He placed it on the coffee table. It wasn't of Ellie Carter. It was of a man. Weathered face, tired eyes, a grizzled beard speckled with gray, a known name in the town. "Do you know who this is?" Calloway asked carefully. Liam's entire body stiffened. His breath hitched. His hands curled into fists. He recognized the man, and in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he said one word: "Hargrove." Claire's breath caught in her throat. Calloway's expression darkened. Daniel Hargrove, a powerful businessman in town, a man with deep connections, a man who had been questioned in Ellie Carter's disappearance but never charged. And now, Liam Evans had said his name. Calloway sat forward, his tone firmer now. "Liam, do you remember seeing him that night?" Liam's breathing grew shallow. His head throbbed. The images were coming faster now. Flashes of movement, moonlight filtering through the trees, the sound of someone pleading. Then, his father's voice. Liam gasped, his hands flying to his head, shaking it violently. "Liam." Claire rushed to him, gripping his arms. "Sweetheart." But Liam was already shutting down, his mind slamming the door on whatever memory was clawing its way to the surface. And in that moment, Calloway realized something chilling. Liam wasn't just afraid of Daniel Hargrove. He was afraid of who else might have been there that night. Because if Daniel Hargrove was involved, then someone else had let it happen. And the only question left was, who? The shadows that linger. The unraveling of truth. Liam sat curled in the corner of his bed, his breath shallow, his fingers digging into the fabric of his blanket. His body trembled from exhaustion, his mind an endless storm of fragmented memories and shadows he couldn't fully grasp. Every time he tried to reach for the truth, it slipped through his fingers like smoke. The name Daniel Hargrove had sent a ripple through his consciousness. He knew that man. He had seen him before. But it wasn't just about Hargrove. It was about his father. Liam's stomach twisted. Daniel Hargrove was a powerful figure in town. His name was spoken in hushed tones, always followed by suspicion, but never evidence. He had money, influence, and the kind of quiet authority that made people look the other way. Had his father been one of them? The thought made him sick. Downstairs, voices echoed from the living room. Liam could hear his mother speaking in urgent, hushed tones with Detective Calloway. He didn't need to hear every word to understand. She was afraid. Afraid of what Liam might remember. Afraid of what it would mean for their family. Afraid of what his father might have done. The breaking point. Daniel Evans sat in his study, his fingers pressed against his temples. A bottle of whiskey sat on the desk beside him, untouched. His thoughts were too loud, his pulse too erratic to stomach even a sip. Liam had spoken. After 5 years, the boy had finally opened his mouth, and the first words he chose had the power to destroy everything. Daniel exhaled sharply. He had worked hard to bury the past, to lock it away, to pretend it never happened. But the past had a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deep it was buried. A knock at the door made him stiffen. Claire. She stepped into the study, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her eyes were red-rimmed. But there was no weakness in them, only steel. "Tell me the truth, Daniel." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the unspoken tremor beneath it. "Were you there that night?" His jaw clenched. "Claire, don't lie to me," she snapped. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Daniel's fingers twitched. He could still feel the weight of that night pressing down on him. The cold air, the rustling leaves, the way the ground felt as he stood frozen in place, watching everything unfold. Claire took a slow step forward. Liam was there, wasn't he? Daniel's breath caught. Claire's expression twisted in horror. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You let him see." He had no response. Because he had no excuse. The memory that refused to stay buried. Liam sat alone in his room, staring at the old notebook in his lap. It was tattered from years of use, pages filled with scattered drawings and half-written notes that never made sense to anyone but him. His fingers traced the edges of a sketch he had made when he was younger. It was messy, frantic, lines overlapping, figures barely distinguishable, but he knew what it was. A forest, a girl, a truck, and something in the shadows. Liam squeezed his eyes shut, willing the memory to surface. It was there. It had always been there, but his mind had locked it away, buried it deep under layers of silence and fear. He had seen Ellie Carter that night. He had seen her run, and he had seen someone chase her down. His breath hitched. He wasn't supposed to remember, but he did. And if he remembered, if he spoke, then he knew exactly what would happen next. The monster in the dark. Detective Calloway leaned against his car, flipping through the case files that had haunted him for years. Ellie Carter's disappearance had been a dead end from the start. No witnesses, no suspects, no leads. Until now. He had always suspected Daniel Hargrove. The man had a reputation, a way of making problems disappear. But now there was something else. Someone else. Liam Evans. A boy who hadn't spoken in 5 years had suddenly broken his silence, and the first words he had uttered had pointed directly to a man Calloway had been trying to take down for years. But something still didn't add up. Why had Liam's father reacted the way he did? Calloway had seen men lie. He had seen men break under the weight of their own secrets. Daniel Evans wasn't a man caught off guard by an innocent mistake. He was a man who had been waiting for this day. And that meant one thing. Liam knew more than he realized. And someone, maybe more than one person, wanted to make sure he stayed silent. The whisper of footsteps. That night, Liam woke to a sound outside his window. A soft rustling. A shadow moving just beyond the glass. His breath caught in his throat. His body went rigid, every muscle screaming for him to stay still. He wasn't sure how he knew, but he did. Someone was watching him. A slow, creeping terror settled over him as he slid from his bed, inching toward the window. The blinds were closed, but he could see the faintest outline of movement beyond them. Then, a whisper. His blood ran cold. Not words. Not a voice he recognized. Just the slow, deliberate sound of someone breathing. His pulse pounded. His fingers curled around the edge of his nightstand. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the presence was gone. The night swallowed the sound, the shadows stretched long and silent. But Liam knew one thing for sure. The past wasn't just a memory anymore. It was coming for him. And this time, it wasn't going to let him go. The eyes in the dark. A truth too heavy to hold. Liam had spent 5 years locked inside his own silence. It had been his shield, his safety. But now, the walls were crumbling. His voice had returned, raw, shaking, but undeniable. And now, the truth was hunting him. The shadow outside his window that night had been real. He wasn't imagining it. Someone was watching. And he knew, deep in his gut, that if he spoke again, if he uncovered the full memory buried deep in his mind, then whoever had been outside his window would come back for him. His mother knew something was wrong. The next morning, Claire hovered near the kitchen, her eyes flicking toward Liam every few seconds, as if expecting him to collapse under the weight of whatever was eating him alive. "You didn't sleep last night," she finally said, breaking the heavy silence between them. Liam didn't respond. He just stirred his untouched cereal, his stomach too tight to eat. Claire sighed, rubbing her temples. "Sweetheart, I need to know what's going on. If something else happened, if you remember more, you have to tell me." Liam's fingers curled around the spoon. He could feel it. The memory. It was right there, hovering on the edge of his mind. He could almost reach it, almost see it. The woods, the cold air biting his skin. Ellie's voice, crying. And then, a deep, familiar voice, a voice he had known his entire life. Liam's breath hitched, his vision blurred. His head pounded like something inside him was screaming, "No, stop, don't remember." His mother's voice cut through the haze. "Liam," he gasped, pulling back so fast his chair scraped against the floor. His heart slammed against his ribs. Claire's face was pale with concern. "Are you okay?" she whispered. Liam didn't answer, because he wasn't sure. The weight of a name. Detective Calloway was tired. The kind of tired that settled into a man's bones after chasing the same truth for years, only to come up empty-handed every time. But this time, he wasn't empty-handed. Liam Evans had given him a name. Daniel Hargrove. And that was the kind of name that could crack open the entire town. Calloway sat in his car outside the Evans house, his fingers drumming against the wheel. He had already put surveillance on them. He wasn't taking any chances. But something about this still felt off. Liam had spoken Hargrove's name, but the boy's reaction afterward told Calloway there was more. A lot more. Something was tangled in this case, something bigger than just Daniel Hargrove. Calloway exhaled, gripping his phone and dialing a number he hadn't called in years. The line rang. Then, a woman's voice. "You better have a good reason for calling me." Calloway smirked. "Come on, Detective Reed. Don't tell me you don't miss me." A short, unimpressed silence. "You working Ellie Carter's case again?" Calloway's smile faded. "Yeah. You found something." He hesitated. Then, finally, "I think I found everything." A house that no longer felt like home. That night, Claire locked the doors twice. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way Liam had looked at her that morning, like something inside him was unraveling. Maybe it was the way Daniel had barely spoken a word all day, pacing his study like a caged animal. Or maybe it was just the bone-deep certainty in her gut that something was coming. She didn't know what. She only knew that it terrified her. She found Liam in his room, sitting on the bed, staring at the window. "Hey," she murmured, sitting beside him. "You're really scaring me, sweetheart." Liam didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Claire's stomach twisted. "Liam." Then, finally, he whispered, "He was outside my window last night." The words sent ice through her veins. She grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "Who?" Liam's lips parted. Then, the front door creaked. Claire stiffened. Liam's breath caught. The house fell into a suffocating silence. Claire's grip on Liam tightened. Slowly, carefully, she reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen, ready to dial 911. Then, a voice. Daniel's voice. "Claire?" She exhaled shakily, releasing Liam. "It's just your father," she murmured, her heart still hammering. But Liam didn't relax. If anything, he stiffened more. Because for some reason, that didn't make him feel any safer. It made him feel worse. A father's lies. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study, staring at the old wooden box he had kept hidden for 5 years. Inside were secrets, his worst mistakes, and now he had a choice. He could tell the truth, or he could keep hiding behind the lies. His hands trembled as he lifted the lid. A newspaper clipping stared back at him. Ellie Carter. Missing. The next article beneath it. Police call off search after months with no leads. Then, no evidence to suggest foul play. Daniel clenched his jaw. Lies. They had always known what happened. They had always known. And now, his son was starting to remember. Daniel pressed his palms against his face, breathing heavily. He had spent 5 years convincing himself he had no choice. But that was a lie, too. He had made a choice, and soon he was going to pay for it. The nightmare returns. Liam woke with a gasp. His skin was damp with sweat. His heart pounded against his ribs. The dream. No, not a dream. A memory. It had finally surfaced. He saw it all now. The woods, the moonlight filtering through the trees, Ellie running, his father, and Daniel Hargrove. The way Ellie had screamed, the way his father had stood there, frozen as Daniel grabbed her, the way he had turned to Liam, 5-year-old Liam, hiding behind a tree, and whispered, "Don't say a word." Liam choked on his own breath, his entire body shaking. He had been there. He had seen it happen. And his father had let it happen. The storm that comes next. Claire woke to a strange sound. At first, she thought it was just the wind. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Inside the house. Her blood ran cold. She shot up, reaching for her phone. The power went out. The room plunged into darkness. A shadow moved in the hallway, and Claire realized, with a cold, sinking horror, whoever had been outside Liam's window last night was inside their house now. The moment the power cut out, Claire knew. Someone was inside the house. She could hear it, the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps in the hallway. Not rushed, not panicked, measured. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Liam was still in his room. Alone. Her instincts kicked in. She barely hesitated before bolting out of bed, moving as quickly and as silently as she could toward his room. The darkness made everything feel surreal, like she had stepped into a nightmare. The air was thick, suffocating. The only sound was the distant hum of her own blood roaring in her ears. She reached his door and pressed her hand against it, forcing herself to breathe. Then she heard it. A voice. Low, rough, unfamiliar. "You shouldn't have remembered, kid." Ice shot through Claire's veins. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She acted. With a surge of adrenaline, she threw the door open. The room was dark, but she could make out 2 figures, one standing near the bed, the other curled up in the corner. Liam. And a man. Claire lunged before she even knew what she was doing. She grabbed the nearest object, a lamp from Liam's nightstand, and swung with everything she had. The figure grunted as the lamp struck his shoulder, stumbling back. Liam let out a sharp, panicked breath. "Mom! Run!" Claire yelled, her voice raw. Liam didn't hesitate. He scrambled up, bolting past her as the intruder regained his footing. Claire turned just in time to see the shadowed figure straighten, his breath coming in heavy bursts. She saw his face for the first time. Not Daniel Hargrove. Not a stranger. Someone worse. Someone she knew. Her stomach turned. No. The man tilted his head, his eyes cold and unreadable. "You should have kept your son quiet, Claire." Then he lunged. The weight of a name. Detective Calloway was already on edge when his phone rang. He had been running over everything in his head. Liam's reaction, the missing pieces, the way Daniel Evans had looked when his son spoke that name. It all pointed to something bigger. Something dangerous. He grabbed his phone and answered on the second ring. This better be important. Calloway. A woman's voice. Shaky. Terrified. Claire Evans. Calloway's back stiffened. "Claire, what's wrong?" "Someone broke into our house." Her voice wavered. "They were in Liam's room. They tried to." She cut off, her breath hitching. "We need help." Calloway didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." The monster in the dark. Liam didn't stop running. His mother's voice had told him to, but he couldn't. His feet pounded against the floor, his breath coming in short gasps. The hallway was a blur. The front door. He needed to get to the front door. He skidded to a stop. A shadow blocked the exit. A second man. Liam barely had time to react before the figure stepped forward, grabbing his arm in a bruising grip. "Gotcha." Liam thrashed, kicked, bit down on the man's wrist hard enough to taste blood. The man cursed, yanking his arm back, just enough for Liam to break free. He didn't think, didn't look back. He bolted toward the kitchen, his mind racing. Weapons, weapons, Weapons. He grabbed the first thing he saw. A knife. The man lunged again. Liam turned and swung. The blade sliced through fabric, barely missing flesh. The man stumbled back, startled. Then he laughed. "Not bad, kid." Liam's hands were shaking. His breath came in fast, shallow bursts. But he didn't back down. He tightened his grip on the knife and lifted his chin, staring his attacker down. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't afraid. A father's sins. Daniel Evans was drunk. Not the light buzz of a casual drink. Not the smooth, numbing kind of intoxication that took the edge off reality. The other kind. The kind that made his head spin. The kind that made the weight of his own sins unbearable. His hands trembled as he poured another glass. Then his phone rang. He ignored it. It rang again. He groaned, snatching it up without checking the caller ID. "What?" A sharp voice on the other end. "Where are you?" Daniel frowned. "What?" Then, "You're not home." The voice wasn't Claire's. It wasn't Calloway's. It was his. Daniel went still. A slow, creeping terror crawled up his spine. The man on the phone let out a quiet chuckle. "You should have left town when you had the chance, Evans." Daniel's stomach dropped. He was too late. They had already gone after Liam. The storm that comes next. The police arrived too late. By the time Calloway burst through the Evans front door, the house was in chaos. Claire was on the floor, breathless but alive, her wrist bruised from fighting off her attacker. Liam was still in the kitchen, standing over a blood-streaked floor, the knife trembling in his grip. And the intruders. Gone. Calloway's pulse roared in his ears. "Where is Daniel?" he demanded. Claire swallowed hard, shaking her head. He wasn't here. Calloway's gut twisted. He turned to Liam. The boy was shaking, but his eyes were steady. "Who are they?" Calloway pressed. Liam's throat bombed. He lifted a shaking hand and pointed at a photograph on the wall. A family picture. His mother, himself, and his father. Calloway's blood went cold. Liam's voice was barely a whisper. They were his friends. And just like that, Calloway knew exactly what kind of man Daniel Evans really was. The lies that bound us. The weight of silence. Liam sat in the back of the police car, his breath still coming in shallow bursts. His hands were curled into fists against his lap, his knuckles white from the pressure. Even though the immediate danger had passed, he couldn't stop shaking. His mother sat beside him, clutching his hand, her grip tight with unspoken fear. Detective Calloway stood just outside the open door, speaking in hushed tones with another officer. Liam barely heard them. His mind was still trapped in that moment. The intruders, the shadows moving through his home, the voice that had whispered to him in the darkness. "You shouldn't have remembered, kid." He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had remembered. And now, everything was falling apart. The night air was cold, biting against his skin as he looked up at the house. His home, now tainted by fear. The front door was still open, casting eerie shadows across the porch. Police officers moved through the house, searching, documenting, securing evidence. But none of it mattered. Because the people who had broken in weren't just criminals. They had come for him. And the worst part, they had been sent by his father. A father's sins, a son's fear. Daniel Evans sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his fingers ached. His phone was still in his lap, the call long since disconnected, but the voice echoed in his mind. "You should have left town when you had the chance, Evans." His stomach churned. He had known this day was coming. He had tried to prepare for it, to bury it beneath layers of silence and denial, but the truth had a way of clawing its way back to the surface. And now his past was coming for his son. He had made a choice that night. 5 years ago, he had watched. He had stood there in the woods, frozen in fear as Daniel Hargrove grabbed Ellie Carter. He had known what was going to happen, and he had let it happen. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was Liam. His son had been there. Small, barefoot, hidden behind the trees, his tiny hands clamped over his mouth as he watched the horror unfold. Daniel had seen him, and he had done the only thing he could think of. He had walked over to his son, knelt beside him in the dirt, and whispered, "Don't say a word. A town that looks away." Detective Calloway's patience was running thin. He had been chasing this case for years, trying to put the pieces together, and now, he finally had what he needed. Or at least, he should have. Instead, he was staring at a mess of corruption, lies, and people too scared to speak. Hargrove had influence, connections, and Daniel Evans. He wasn't innocent. Calloway turned to Claire, who sat stiffly on the curb, her arms wrapped protectively around Liam. "We need to talk," Calloway said carefully. "Inside." Claire hesitated but nodded. Inside the house, the remnants of the break-in were everywhere. A broken lamp, scattered papers, the eerie silence of a home that no longer felt safe. Calloway sat across from them at the dining table, his hands folded. "I'm not going to lie to you," he said, looking directly at Claire. "Whoever came here tonight, they weren't just looking to scare you. They were here to send a message." Claire's fingers tightened around Liam's. Calloway continued, his tone steady but firm. "Your son remembered something he wasn't supposed to. And the people who buried the truth are getting desperate." Claire swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Calloway leaned forward. "We find out everything. Now, before they get to him again." He turned to Liam. "Kid," he said softly, "I need you to tell me everything you remember about that night." Liam hesitated. He could feel his mother's grip on his hand, could feel the weight of her fear. But more than that, he could feel the memory pressing against his mind, just waiting to be let out. Slowly, he nodded. And then, for the first time in 5 years, he told the truth. The memory that broke him. It started in flashes. The woods, the damp air, the way the trees loomed over him, stretching high and endless. He was 5 years old, small, helpless, and he was hiding. He could hear voices, Ellie's voice, crying, begging, and his father's voice, not the one he knew. Not the soft, reassuring voice that read him bedtime stories. This one was different. This one was afraid. Liam's breath hitched as the memory came in sharper now. He could see his father standing there, a few feet away. Could see Daniel Hargrove in front of him, his hands wrapped around Ellie's wrist. And then, a struggle. Ellie tried to run. Hargrove pulled her back. His father did nothing. Liam's stomach twisted. He remembered now. He remembered it all. Ellie had fallen to the ground, her breath coming in sharp sobs. Hargrove had looked down at her. And then, without hesitation, he had picked up a rock. Liam flinched. The memory was too real now, too raw. And his father had turned away, had covered Liam's eyes, had whispered, "Don't look, son, don't look." But Liam had looked. He had seen everything. And then his father had knelt beside him, gripping his tiny shoulders, and said, "You don't tell anyone, ever." A family fractured beyond repair. When Liam finished speaking, the room was silent. His breath was unsteady. His hands were trembling. Claire was staring at him, her face pale, her lips parted in horror. But Calloway looked furious. Not at Liam. At his father. At Daniel Evans, the man who had made a choice 5 years ago. A choice that had stolen his son's voice. A choice that had led to this moment. Claire finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where is he?" Calloway didn't hesitate. "We'll find him, and this time." He wasn't going to let Daniel Evans bury the truth. A man on the run. Daniel knew the moment he saw the flashing blue lights in his rearview mirror. It was over. He gripped the steering wheel, his pulse roaring in his ears. He could run. He could keep running, keep hiding, keep pretending. But Liam had spoken. And once the truth was out, it could never be buried again. As the police car pulled up beside him, he exhaled shakily. And for the first time in 5 years, Daniel Evans accepted his fate, the end of silence. Liam stood on the front porch, watching as the police car pulled into the driveway. His father stepped out, handcuffed, defeated. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Liam wasn't afraid. His father had taken his voice once. But now Liam had taken it back. The truth that refused to stay buried. A house of ghosts. Liam stood at the top of the stairs, watching as the police led his father out of the house in handcuffs. Daniel Evans did not fight. He didn't plead. He didn't even look at his wife or son. He just kept his head low, his face an unreadable mask, as if he had already accepted his fate. The town had come alive with whispers. Neighbors stood on their porches, their faces half-lit by the flashing red and blue lights. Some murmured to each other in shock. Others shook their heads, as if they had suspected something like this for years. Claire stood beside Liam, gripping his hand so tightly it hurt. But he didn't pull away. Because even though his father was the one being taken away, Liam felt like he was the one being set free. The silence that had once suffocated him was gone. And in its place, only the truth remained. The final confession. Detective Calloway sat across from Daniel Evans in the cold, sterile interrogation room. The walls were gray. The overhead light buzzed faintly. But Calloway barely noticed. His focus was locked on the man in front of him. Daniel looked exhausted. Dark circles clung beneath his eyes. His hands were still cuffed, resting on the table between them. Calloway exhaled, leaning forward. "You let a man kill a 17-year-old girl." His voice was steady, but sharp. "And you covered it up for 5 years." Daniel didn't flinch. He just closed his eyes for a long moment before finally speaking. "I didn't kill her," he murmured. "But you let it happen," Calloway pressed. A muscle in Daniel's jaw twitched. "Yes." The word hung between them, heavy and irreversible. Calloway leaned back, arms crossed. "Start from the beginning." Daniel swallowed hard, his shoulders sinking. Then he began. 5 years ago. The woods near Oak Ridge Hollow. Ellie Carter had seen something she wasn't supposed to see. Hargrove was making deals with the wrong kind of people. Money was exchanging hands where it shouldn't have been. Ellie had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had run, and Daniel Hargrove had gone after her. Daniel Evans had been there. He had been drinking with Hargrove that night, had heard the shouting, the struggle. And when he stepped forward, when he saw Ellie on the ground, pleading, crying, begging, he had frozen. He had told himself he wasn't the kind of man who could do something like this. He had told himself he wasn't a monster. But he had done nothing. And then he had seen Liam, his 5-year-old son, hiding behind the trees, watching everything. Daniel clenched his fists against the table. I panicked. I told Liam to keep quiet. I told him it wasn't real, that he didn't see anything. Calloway's expression darkened. "You silenced your own son," he said. Daniel exhaled shakily. "What else could I do?" "You could have done the right thing," Calloway snapped. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "Men like Hargrove don't let loose ends walk away." His eyes were hollow. "I knew if I said anything, my family wouldn't be safe. If Liam talked, if he told anyone, Hargrove would have come for him." "So you let your son suffer in silence for 5 years instead," Calloway said coldly. Daniel's hands trembled. "I thought I was protecting him." Calloway scoffed. "No, Evans, you were protecting yourself. The man who would not be found, Hargrove, had disappeared. The moment Liam spoke his name, the man had gone underground. No credit card activity, no bank withdrawals. A man like Hargrove didn't run because he was afraid. He ran because he was planning something. And Calloway knew one thing for certain. He wasn't done yet. The trap that was set. 3 nights later, the Evans home sat in eerie silence. Claire had taken Liam to a safe house under police protection. But Calloway had a feeling Hargrove wasn't after them anymore. No, Hargrove was after one thing. Loose ends. Which meant he was coming for Daniel Evans. The police had let the news of Daniel's confession slip on purpose. It was bait, and they didn't have to wait long. It was past midnight when the sound came. The back door creaking open. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Calloway was waiting in the dark, his gun drawn. He barely breathed as he watched a figure move through the shadows, heading toward the study. Daniel Evans had been left there, alone, unguarded. Hargrove had taken the bait. And the moment he stepped into the room, Calloway flipped the light on. "Put your hands where I can see them." Hargrove froze. Then, slowly, he turned. His face was unreadable. "You always were a persistent bastard, Calloway." Calloway smirked. "And you were always a reckless bastard, Hargrove." Hargrove didn't fight. Didn't plead. Didn't run. He just let out a slow breath, as if he had already resigned himself to his fate. The officers moved in, handcuffing him, reading him his rights. And for the first time in 5 years, the case was closed. The end of silence. Liam sat on the porch of the safe house, staring at the sky. The stars were bright. The air was crisp. For the first time in years, he felt light. His father was in prison. Hargrove was in custody. And the silence that had suffocated him for so long, was finally gone. Claire sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "You okay?" she asked softly. Liam hesitated. Then, finally, he nodded. "Yeah," he whispered. And this time, his voice didn't shake. The town that would never forget. Hargrove's arrest made headlines. Daniel Evans' confession sent shockwaves through the community. People had whispered about Ellie Carter's disappearance for years, but now they had answers. And now, they had justice. It didn't bring Ellie back, but it gave her a voice. And for Liam, for the boy who had spent 5 years in silence, it gave him something to. Freedom. The silent witness no more. Liam Evans had spent years trapped in the past, but not anymore. He was done being silent. He was done being afraid. And as he stood outside his home, staring at the town that had once felt like a prison, he knew one thing for certain. Some truths refused to stay buried. And some voices, they were never meant to be silenced.